buried beneath centuries of dust, hidden in a locked archive, lies a record never meant to be read. Not because it was false, but because if it's true, then human history began with a secret we were never supposed to uncover. There is a tablet in the basement, archives of a major European museum, that was not supposed to survive. It was meant to be broken before burial. The man who dug it up in the autumn of 1881 reported that it was already in 3 pieces when he lifted it from the floor of a sealed chamber. The pieces were photographed, cataloged with a label that did not appear in the public records, and locked into a sealed case in the second basement of the museum. They were not translated for almost a century, when a German Assyriologist named Tobias Reinhardt finally made a working translation. In 1968, his manuscript was taken. His research contract was not renewed, and he spent the last 20 years of his life trying to publish what he had found in journals that would not return his letters. The tablet describes a species. The Sumerian scribe makes the difference, with care repeating the point 3 different ways across the opening lines that what came down was not a god from religious imagination, but a population with bodies and biology and children. Something came down from the place above the sky, the tablet says, and it did one specific thing while it was here. It bred with humans. The tablet uses the standard Sumerian word for breeding, the same word the scribes used when they wrote about animal breeding. The species chose human women. It mated with them according to a ritual the tablet describes in 11 separate clauses, and it produced offspring. Those offspring had children. Those children had children. The tablet says that the bloodline did not die out. It says that the bloodline was carefully preserved, tracked across centuries, moved quietly into places where it could continue without being disturbed by the wider human population. The tablet ends with a single line written 3 times in the same hand. The blood is in the kings. The blood is in the kings. The blood is in the kings. This is what the tablet says. This is what the photographic record confirms. And this is why a careful German scholar lost his career trying to tell the world what he had. Read. The tablet was found in October of 1881 during the Second Nineveh expedition of Hormuzd Rassam, the Iraqi-born archaeologist working under the care of the British Museum. Rassam had been digging at the Kuyunjik Mound for several years, recovering tablet after tablet from what had once been the Great Library of Ashurbanipal, the Assyrian king who had ordered scribes throughout his empire to copy every important text they could find onto fresh clay. Most of what Rassam recovered was cataloged in the Standard Case series and later translated. This tablet was different, according to Rassam's field notes, which were never published in full and which survive only in broken form in the museum's institutional archives. The tablet was found inside a sealed cedarwood box in a chamber that had no other entrance than the original sealed door. The cedarwood box had been wrapped in wax, soaked cloth, sealed in pitch, then placed inside an outer container of fired clay. Whoever had buried it had clearly meant for it to remain untouched for a very long time. When Rassam opened the cedarwood box, the tablet was already broken. The breakage was not the kind caused by collapse or pressure. The pieces had clean edges, and the breaks ran through the tablet at 3 specific points that divided the text into roughly equal sections. Someone had purposely broken the tablet into 3 pieces before burying it. Rassam wrote in his field journal that whoever had done this had wanted the tablet to be preserved but not to be read easily, that the breakage was an act of careful sabotage by someone who could not make themselves destroy the text completely. The pieces arrived at the British Museum in March of 1882. They were photographed twice, and the photographs were filed in the museum's restricted archive. The tablet itself was given the catalog label K39 and was placed in a locked case in the second basement in a section kept for materials judged too sensitive for general scholarly access. The catalog entry listed it as a Neo-Babylonian religious text, partial, in poor condition, waiting for translation. No translation was attempted for 66 years. Tobias Reinhardt was born in Hamburg in 1919. He finished his doctorate at Göttingen under Wolfram von Soden, and by 1957 had become a research associate at the British Museum with permission to enter the restricted archive in the second basement. In early 1962, while reviewing the photographic record of K39, for the first time he saw that the text was not Neo-Babylonian at all. The script was an early Sumerian hand, changed slightly by Akkadian conventions, showing that it had been copied from an older original sometime in the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second because what I am about to tell you gets much darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete decoding of all 12 codes, the tablet numbers, the translated passages, the astronomical date they gave down to the degree. I put it all into a written document. It is linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now let us continue. He asked for permission to translate the tablet in full. Permission was granted, with the condition that his findings be submitted to the museum's review committee before any outside publication. Reinhardt agreed to the condition. He spent 6 years on the translation, working from the photographs, because the tablet itself was considered too fragile to handle. By the autumn of 1968, he had a complete draft. He submitted it to the review committee in November. The committee never responded. In February of 1969, Reinhardt was told by letter that his research contract would not be renewed. He was offered a small severance payment and a recommendation for a teaching position at a regional university in northern Germany. His translation manuscript was kept by the museum on the grounds that it contained references to other restricted materials. His personal copy, which he had kept in his rented flat in Bloomsbury, was missing from his desk. When he returned to pack his belongings, Reinhardt spent the rest of his life trying to rebuild his translation from the photographic copies he had quietly kept. He published 3 short papers in little-known journals, describing fragments of the text in carefully indirect language. He died of a stroke in 1991, leaving behind a sealed wooden trunk that his widow gave to the University of Uppsala in 1994, with instructions that it not be opened for 10 years. A doctoral student named Ingrid Mossberg opened it in 2004. The trunk contained Reinhardt's rebuilt translation, his photographic plates, his letters, with the museum and a handwritten note that read in German, "This is what they did not want you to know." The species the tablet describes is called the Eden Nungal in the Sumerian text. The compound roughly means the great princes of the plain, or the high ones who came down to the cultivated land. They are described from the very first line as a kind of being, a species, a population with inner structure and rank and reproductive biology. They are not gods in the religious sense. They are flesh and blood with bodies that age and minds that think and a culture that the scribe thought was worth careful recording. According to the tablet, the Eden Nungal arrived in 7 waves. each made up of between 40 and 70 individuals. They came down in vessels. The tablet describes as boats of fire that landed at specific marked places across what is now southern Iraq, eastern Syria, and the highlands of western Iran. The waves arrived over a period of about 400 years, beginning at a date the tablet places before the founding of Eridu, before the first cities, before the invention of writing, in any form known to current archaeology. The Eden Nungal had bodies similar to human bodies, but larger. The tablet gives an average height of 7 hands above the standard man of the period, which matches roughly 2 1/4 m. Their skin was paler than the skin of the local population. Their hair was lighter, ranging from the color of ripe wheat to the color of ash. Their eyes were noted with special care, and the tablet uses 3 different words for eye color across individuals, showing a range that included gray, pale blue, and the deep color of lapis lazuli. They lived for periods of between 300 and 700 years. Their inner rank system consisted of 7 levels. At the top were 3 individuals. The tablet refers to simply as the elders, who never took part in the breeding program. Below them were the 7 captains, who organized the work and kept the family records. Below the captains were the technicians, the laborers, the gardeners, the keepers, and the soldiers. The breeding happened only at the level of the captains and the technicians. Only those 2 ranks, the tablet says, carried what the scribe calls the seed of continuance. The Eden Nungal were on the earth, according to the tablet, for about 3,000 years. They left in 7 waves, the same way they had arrived. The last of them departed at a date the tablet places about 500 years before the rule of Sargon of Akkad, which would match around 2,800 before the Common Era. They left behind their structures, their tools, their records, and their children. The breeding program described in the tablet is methodical in a way that troubles modern readers who see it for the first time. It is not a story of seduction or of divine union or of cosmic love. It is a procedural document written by a scribe who understood the program as the operation of a system and who recorded that system the way a Sumerian scribe of the period would have recorded the management of a state, grain reserve, or a temple herd of cattle. The 11 clauses of the breeding ritual lay out the process in order. The first clause concerns the selection of women. The Eden Nungal did not take women at random. They chose from specific human lineages picked for what the tablet calls the receptive trait, a family ability to carry the hybrid pregnancy to full term. Women of these lineages were identified in childhood, marked with a small tattoo at the base of the neck and tracked by the captains throughout their lives. When such a woman reached the age of fertility, she was brought to one of the breeding houses at the top of a major ziggurat. The second clause concerns the timing. The women were brought to the breeding houses during specific phases of the lunar cycle and at specific seasons of the year with astronomical precision that suggests the Eden Nungal had access to calendrical knowledge the local population did not yet have. The third clause concerns the preparation. The women were bathed in water mixed with substances. The tablet does not name, fed, specific foods for 7 days before the union and taught a small set of phrases in the Eden Nungal language. They were not forced. They came willingly, because the families of the marked lineages had been told for generations that this was an honor and that the lineage itself would be protected forever. The tablet notes with what reads as quiet bitterness on the part of the later scribe that these promises were mostly kept. The fourth and fifth clauses concern the union itself, described in clinical language without metaphor. The sixth clause concerns the pregnancy. The hybrid pregnancies lasted longer than human pregnancies, between 11 and 12 lunar months. The women were kept in the breeding houses for the whole time, cared for by Eden Nungal physicians, and by older women of the marked lineages who had themselves given birth to hybrid children. The seventh clause concerns the birth. The infants were examined at once for what the tablet calls the signs. There were 9 signs, which the scribe lists separately. Infants who showed at least 6 were kept and raised by the Eden Nungao. Infants who showed fewer than 6 were returned to the mother's family and raised as ordinary humans, though always under the quiet watch of the captains. Before we move on to the next code, stop for a second. What you just heard about Code 9 is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original Sumerian notation. The population number, the trigger, conditions, the specific references to the life code manipulation. It is all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, get it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. The QR code is on your screen. The 8th clause concerns the raising. The kept children were taught by Eden Nungal teachers in language, mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, and the family record. They were taught the names of every Eden Nungao individual they had descended from, going back to the original waves of arrival. The 9th and 10th clauses concerned the placement. When the kept children reached adulthood, they were placed in positions of leadership among the local human population. They were made priests, scribes, military commanders, and eventually kings. The tablet states this plainly. The kings of the early cities were the children of the Eden Nungao. The 11th clause concerns the continuation. The placed children were instructed to marry within their own kind whenever possible, to mate with other hybrid descendants in order to strengthen the bloodline. When this was not possible, they were instructed to marry humans of the marked lineages in order to keep the receptive trait for future generations. The practice was to continue forever beyond the departure of the Eden Nungal themselves, until what the scribe calls the time of reunion. The 9 signs by which the hybrid children were identified at birth are listed in the tablet in a specific order. Reinhardt's translation preserves the order, and the order itself seems to carry meaning. The signs move from the most visible and outside traits to the most subtle and inner ones. The first sign was size. Hybrid infants were larger at birth than ordinary human infants, often by a large amount. The tablet records average birth weights that would match, in modern measurement, to between 4 and 5 kilograms. The second sign was the shape of the head. Hybrid infants had long skulls with a cranial vault that extended farther back than the human norm. This shape remained into adulthood. The tablet notes that the captains of the Eden Nungal themselves had this skull shape, and that the trait was considered the most reliable marker of pure descent. The third sign was the color of the eyes. The eyes of hybrid infants were almost always pale, ranging from gray to the lapis blue color of the upper ranks of the Eden Nungal themselves, in a region where the local human population had almost completely brown eyes. This trait was striking and obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. The fourth sign was the number of digits. A small percentage of hybrid children, about 1 in 12, according to the tablet, were born with a 6th finger on each hand. This trait was considered especially fortunate and was connected with what the tablet calls the gift of working, an unusual hand skill, and ability for craft. The fifth sign was a mark at the base of the spine. Hybrid. Infants often showed a small patch of changed skin or a faint scar-like mark at the base of the spine in the area of the sacrum. The tablet does not explain the origin of this mark. It simply notes its presence and that it remained into adulthood. The sixth sign was the cry. Hybrid infants did not cry in the way human infants did. Their first sounds were described by the tablet as deeper, more rhythmic, and shorter in length than the cry of an ordinary newborn. The seventh sign was the resistance. Hybrid children rarely caught the common diseases that harmed the local population. They survived plagues that killed entire villages. They recovered quickly from injuries. They lived on average much longer than ordinary humans, with the tablet recording typical lifespans of 122, 180 years for first-generation hybrids. The eighth sign was the knowing. The tablet describes this trait in language that is hard to translate exactly. Hybrid children from a very early age seemed to know things they had not been taught. They learned languages quickly. They understood instructions before the instructions were finished. They remembered events from before they were old enough by human standards to form lasting memories. The scribe records this sign with what reads as awe, showing that the knowing was the trait by which the Eden Nungal themselves had first been recognized as something other than human. The ninth sign, listed last, was the orientation. Hybrid children, the tablet says, always faced the upper region when they slept. They turned their heads, even as infants, toward the direction from which their fathers had first descended. The tablet says that this trait was not learned. It appeared in children who had been raised entirely by their human mothers, who had never been taught about the Eden Nungal, who had no conscious knowledge of their own origins. They turned upward in their sleep without being told to. The tablet is not the only record of what it describes. This is one of the reasons Reinhardt's discovery was so disturbing to the scholars who reviewed his work, and one of the reasons, perhaps, that his translation was suppressed. The same story, in different language and with different names, appears in the religious and mythological traditions of nearly every ancient civilization that left written records of its early period. The most direct parallel is the Hebrew passage in the 6th chapter of Genesis, which describes the sons of God taking the daughters of men as wives and producing the Nephilim, the heroes of old, the men of renown. The Hebrew text mirrors the Sumerian tablet. The selection is deliberate. The mating is procedural. The offspring are different from ordinary humans, larger, longer-lived, and placed into positions of leadership. The Book of Enoch, excluded from the canonical Hebrew Bible but preserved in the Ethiopian tradition, develops the account in greater detail. The Watchers descend in groups, take human wives, teach humans forbidden knowledge, and produce hybrid offspring whose bloodlines continue through the flood and into the historical period. The Greek mythological tradition is filled with the same theme. Zeus, Poseidon, Apollo, and the other Olympian gods regularly take human women as partners. The offspring are demigods, larger and stronger than ordinary humans, with special gifts of intelligence and long life, who become the founding heroes of royal lines. Hercules, Perseus, Achilles, Theseus, and the rest of the heroic list are not simply characters in entertaining stories. They are the founders of the ruling houses of the Greek city-states. The pattern is identical to the Sumerian one. beings from somewhere else mate with chosen humans, and the offspring become kings. The Hindu Vedic tradition speaks of the Asuras and the Devas, heavenly beings, who descended in the early ages, and of the Nagas, serpent beings, who interbred with human royal lines and produced the founders of the Naga dynasties of southern India and Cambodia. The Mahabharata records specific family lines. The Pandava brothers, the heroes of the great epic, are each fathered by a different god upon their human mother. This is presented as genealogical fact. In the same matter-of-fact tone, the Sumerian tablet uses the Norse tradition records the mixing of the Asir and the Jotnar with human lineages, producing the king heroes of the sagas. The Egyptian tradition speaks of the gods walking among humans in the early time, the Zep-Tepi, and of their bloodlines being preserved through the priestly and royal lines of the dynastic period. The Mesoamerican traditions of Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkan describe a fair-skinned, bearded figure who came from across the sea, taught civilization, and fathered children with the local nobility before leaving with the promise of return. The Dogon of West Africa preserve a tradition of the Namo, amphibious beings from the star Sirius, who mated with the ancestors of the Dogon nobility. The Sumerian tablet is the oldest version of the account, but it is one document in a global record. If the tablet is correct, and if the cross-cultural record reflects a single historical event rather than a coincidence of unrelated mythologies, then the bloodline still exists. The 11th clause says that the descendants were to maintain the line forever, mating within the bloodline whenever possible and tracking the family line across centuries. The closing line of the tablet, repeated 3 times, states that the blood is in the kings. The question Reinhardt was working on when his contract was ended, and the question that appears in his letters in the years after is the question of where the blood is. Now, several lines of physical evidence suggest answers. The elongated skulls of the Paracas region in southern Peru, dating from about the 3rd century before the Common Era through the 1st century of the Common Era, show a cranial shape that cannot be explained by artificial cranial deformation alone. Some show foramen, magnum positioning, and cranial capacity that is structurally different from the surrounding population. DNA analyses on Paracas skulls in 2014 and again in 2018 returned mitochondrial sequences that did not match standard human haplogroup distributions. The full data has never been published in a peer-reviewed journal. The Habsburg lineage of Central Europe, traced in an unbroken family record from the 11th century through the present, shows a cluster of physical traits, including the famous mandibular prognathism and the elongated facial structure. The usual explanation is the inbreeding of the lineage, but the choice to keep that inbreeding is itself a fact needing explanation. Why did the family insist, generation after generation, on marrying only within itself when the medical consequences were openly noticed by the 18th century? The 11th clause of the Sumerian tablet gives an answer, if an unsettling one. The commercial DNA testing services and the academic projects that have built large databases of human genetic variation have begun to produce data that points in directions some researchers have found hard to discuss publicly. Certain mitochondrial lineages cluster within specific royal and aristocratic families across continents with a tightness that pure chance does not predict. Certain Y chromosomal markers track through the male lines of European, Indian, and East Asian royal houses with patterns that suggest common ancestry far more recent than the standard timeline would allow. Reinhardt, in his later letters, wrote that he believed the bloodline was still being actively tracked, that the suppression of his translation had been ordered not by the museum itself, but by individuals with private interests in the matter who exercised influence over the museum's policies. He did not name these individuals. He died before he could. What the tablet describes, if any of it is accurate, is that the human species is not completely one species. It is that for about 3,000 years, a different population from somewhere else mated with selected human lineages produced offspring whose descendants are still among us, and instructed those descendants to preserve themselves in positions of authority where they had been placed. The kings of the early cities were the children of this program, and the kings of the historical period descended from those original children. The tablet ends with the same line repeated 3 times. The blood is in the kings. The blood is in the kings. The blood is in the kings. Reinhardt, in the last letter he wrote before his stroke, asked the question the tablet itself does not answer. If the blood is in the kings, and if the bloodline has been kept for 5,000 years according to the instructions of beings that left long ago, then the question is what those beings are coming back for and when. The 11th clause speaks of the time of reunion. It does not give the date. It says only that the children of the Eden Nungal will know it when it arrives, because they will turn their heads toward the upper region one final time the way they did as infants, and they will not turn away, whether you carry the blood or not. The question is worth holding. The records exist. The family lines exist. The signs, if the tablet is to be believed, still exist in the bodies of the descendants, and somewhere in the basement archive of a major European museum, in a sealed case in the second basement, 3 pieces of broken clay continue to record what was done in the early